Good morning, economics. Welcome to our next week here. We are starting this week off by putting our supply and demand together, seeing how when we combine them together, when we put these two together, we get what we call a market price and what we actually call equilibrium price. So, to start us off, I just want to give us a quick illustration of how bringing supply and demand together can impact the price and the quantity of items. So if we go back to April 15, 2010, to Iceland, we will discover that a volcano erupted on that day in Iceland. The volcano's name, I'm not even going to try to say. I'm going to spell it for you. You can try and figure out how to say it. Eyjafjallajokull. That's the name of the volcano. Not even going to try to say that. For the first few hours after the eruption began, the world's attention was focused on the thick black cloud of smoke rising from the volcano, as is the case with most volcanic events. But as the hours passed, a new concern arose. The ash particles from the volcano were quickly spreading to the continent of Europe. Remember, this is in Iceland, not too far away. Airline safety experts believed that the particles could clog jet engines and even bring down a plane. As a result, 24 countries grounded all flights and closed down their airports. In some countries, airports remained closed for more than a week. Thousands of flights were canceled. The airport closings had some immediate effects. The most direct impact was on the tourists and business travelers who could not take trips or who were stranded and unable to return home. But the volcano also had indirect effects on prices for goods and services around the world. For example, within days, the price of salmon in China and Japan skyrocketed, even though both countries were untouched by the ash from the volcano. And in the global market for jet fuel, the price dipped. Why did prices change in these markets? Before the volcano erupted, the supply and demand for jet fuel and salmon were in balance. After the volcano erupted, the balance changed. In the market for jet fuel, the cancellation of flights caused a sharp drop in demand. This decrease in demand caused the price of jet fuel to fall. In the case of salmon, because most of the fresh salmon sold in Asia is caught in Norway and delivered by jet, the salmon could not be delivered. So there was a sharp drop in the supply of salmon, which caused the price to rise. When either supply or demand changes, the price and quantity adjust as well. This lecture and the next two lectures after this, so the next three lectures starting with this one, is going to consider how the forces of supply and demand interact to determine the price that a good sells for and how much of it is bought and sold. Previously, we learned that the market demand curve tells us how much of a good buyers want to buy at each possible price. We also learned about the market supply curve, which tells us the quantity firms will offer for sale at each price. But what determines the price that will actually be charged in the market? For example, why do the shorts at the mall cost around $30 rather than, let's say, $5 or $90, although certainly some are in those ranges as well? To answer this question, we must think about both sides of the market, supply and demand, at the same time. And here we can see, right, just to jog our memory, here we have a demand curve, right, and here's our supply curve, right? And so for demand, we can see the law of demand. As the price drops, quantity demanded increases because as consumers, we as consumers, we're the ones demanding the product, right? So as the price of, in this case, shorts drops, there's going to be greater demand. And over here, now wearing the other hat, wearing the hat of a supplier, of a firm making shorts, as the price rises, right, as we go this way, we see that quantity is also going to rise, right? So that's a quick review. And the question is, and what we're going to cover now, is what happens when we put these two together. on the single graph when we look at how they interact with each other. So our key idea is that the interaction of supply and demand determines the price at which a good is sold in the market and the quantity of the good that is exchanged between buyers and sellers. We're going to find out that if we put these two together, we can figure out what the price is and how much is going to be demanded and supplied, and that's going to be the same. So that's how much is going to be exchanged, how much of that good, the quantity of that good is going to be exchanged by buyers and sellers at that price. Our learning objectives for this particular lecture is that we are going to be able to demonstrate how supply and demand work together to determine the price and quantity of a good. After this lecture, you should be able to explain why market equilibrium occurs when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And you should be able to recognize how market forces cause the market price and quantity to adjust to equilibrium. As we explore the crossroads of supply and demand, our first step is to define the market we are talking about. We know that a market is a collection of people who could potentially buy or sell a good during a particular time period. A market could be as small as the people in one particular neighborhood, or could be all the people in the global economy, depending on where buyers and sellers of the good in question are located. For our example, we will use the entire U.S. market for cotton shorts, consisting of all buyers and sellers in the United States. We'll imagine that the offerings by each firm are the same, and that, therefore, we are talking about a market that is perfectly competitive. Our next step in determining the market price is to combine the supply and demand curves in the same graph, as shown below. We can combine the two curves because the separate supply and demand graphs each have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. And therefore, we can plot both lines on the same graph. Notice that the x-axis, which is labeled quantity of shorts, millions of pairs or in millions, represents either the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied, depending on which curve we are looking at. The purpose of putting the two curves together is to find the point of equilibrium in the market. At the market equilibrium, which is point E, which is going to be right here, this is point E, the quantity of shorts firms are willing to supply equals the quantity of shorts consumers are willing to buy. So notice that that point where on our supply curve, right, and where it crosses our demand curve, we are at, in this case, 5 million pairs of shorts, right? And that is what we call equilibrium, where our supply and demand curves cross. You can think of the equilibrium point as the point of rest in the market, resulting from a balance of forces. Think of a seesaw that is in equilibrium when two people of equal weight are on the opposite sides, right? Neither is touching the ground. That seesaw is balanced perfectly, and that's what we get here. That's the kind of the concept we're trying to get at here. When we have supply and demand equal, they are in perfect balance, and therefore our curves cross or intersect there at point E. In equilibrium, there is no tendency for either side to to rise or fall. In a similar way, a market has reached its equilibrium point when there is no tendency for the price or quantity to change because the forces of supply and demand are in balance. On a supply and demand graph, the equilibrium is represented by the point where the two curves intersect, and we've already stated that. That's going to be right here. And often, this is going to be called point E on almost all graphs in which we were combining demand and supply, because again, this is the equilibrium point. Okay. At this point, the price is $30 per pair of shorts. And that $30 applies to both the $30 that is on the demand curve. Remember, if this was just a demand curve, we would say that at this point, demand is 5 million, right? 5 million down here. We'll get to that in a moment. 5 million pairs of shorts when they are $30 a piece, right? That's the quantity demanded at $30. And then on our supply curve, remember, we would say the firms are willing to supply 5 million quantities of shorts at $30. So this is what we end up calling our equilibrium price, because it is at our equilibrium point where our supply and demand curves cross. We also have our equilibrium quantity, which just happens to be here, right? We just go down our graph here to our x-axis, quantity of shorts. We can see, as I've already said, that our equilibrium quantity is where that point crosses again, and this happens to be 5 million pairs of shorts. So this is, for this particular graph, our equilibrium quantity is 5 million pairs of shorts. The quantity supplied and demanded at the equilibrium price is called the equilibrium quantity, which is what I just stated. Because the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied at this point, we know that every pair of shorts that firms want to sell will have a willing buyer. With this balance, there is no tendency for the equilibrium price or quantity to change unless something causes the supply curve or the demand curve to shift. In the markets for most goods and services, powerful forces move the price and quantity towards their equilibrium values. We can explore these forces by asking what happens when the price is below or above the equilibrium price. So what happens when price is below equilibrium? Well, here in our table, on our graph, we can see what would happen if the market price started out at $20 per pair, which is below the equilibrium price of $30. At $20 per pair, consumers would want to buy 7 million pairs of shorts, as shown here, right? At $20 on our demand, which is blue, we have 7 million. But firms would supply only 2 million pairs, right? So for firms, which is our supply, orange now, we are at our $20 price, we are at 2 million. When the quantity demanded is larger than the quantity supplied, which we see here, quantity demanded 7 million, larger than quantity supplied 2 million, the difference between them is called excess demand. So in our example, our excess demand is 7 million minus 2 million, or 5 million pairs of shorts. And we can see that right here. So if we were to, we would just take the difference between here and here, which happens to be 5 million. This is our, let me rewrite that 5 million a little clearer. This is our excess demand. When there is excess demand, the price will not remain where it is for long. Some consumers will be unable to purchase all the shorts they want to buy at the market price. Rather than going without, they would gladly pay more to get what they want. At the same time, firms will see shorts disappearing from store shelves, lines forming, and consumers willing to pay higher prices. In response, firms will raise the price of shorts above $20 per pair. What happens next is even more interesting. As the price of shorts rises, the quantity of shorts demanded will decrease. This follows the law of demand that we learned previously. The result is a leftward movement, right? So a leftward movement along our demand curve, that way. At the same time, the rising price causes the quantity supplied to increase. This follows the law of supply, which we learned just last week in our previous lectures. The increase in the quantity supplied is seen as a rightward movement along the supply curve, again, towards our equilibrium price, where they intersect. These movements along the two curves shrink the gap between them. In other words, it's shrinking our excess demand. As the price rises, the excess demand for shorts gets smaller. When will the price stop rising? Only when it reaches the equilibrium price, right here, of $30. Until the price hits $30, the excess demand continues to exert upward pressure on the price. But at $30, with no gap between the supply and demand curves, there is no more excess demand to push the price higher. At our equilibrium price, which is $30, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are both 5 million pairs. There are enough shorts for every consumer to buy as many as desired at the market price. What happens when price is above equilibrium? Similar market forces are at work whenever the market price is above the equilibrium price. Here, we have started above at $40 for shorts. At this price, firms are willing to supply 8 million pairs of shorts, but consumers only want 3 million. Again, we're looking at our orange for supply, what firms are willing to supply, and our blue, which is our demand curve, for what consumers are willing to purchase at a given price. And so at $40, the quantity demanded is 3 million pairs of shorts, and the quantity supplied is 8 million. When the quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded, the difference between them is called excess supply. And again, with excess supply, we're going to give it a number, just like we did with excess demand, right? And in this case, it is also 5 million, the difference between 8 and 3. So this also is 5 million, and this is excess supply. An excess supply causes sellers to be frustrated because they cannot sell all the 8 million pairs of shorts they are producing. As firms compete with each other to find customers, they will offer shorts at lower and lower prices. So the market price of shorts, which started at 40 per pair, will fall. As the price falls, the quantity demanded rises, causing a movement along the demand curve from our point here. Let me get a different color, sorry, here, right? Causing movement here, downwards, movement on our demand curve to the right, which is going to be downward movement on our demand curve. Notice that means that the price is falling, but the quantity demanded is rising. At the same time, the quantity supplied falls as the firms lower their price, and that means the quantity that they're willing to supply is going to fall as well. And just like with excess demand, we're going to see that these falling prices and rising demand, falling price and falling supply, are going to meet each other at our equilibrium point here. $30, 5 million pairs of shorts. Right, so as those firms continue to drop the price, eventually they're going to reach a point where they sell all that they are producing at that particular price, in our example, $30. So every pair they produce has demand and is sold, and that equals equilibrium. We've just learned that whenever the market price is different from the equilibrium price, market forces move the price towards its equilibrium value. The graphic below summarizes how this happens. When the market price is higher than the equilibrium price, there is excess supply and the market price falls. When the market price is lower than the equilibrium price, there is excess demand and the market price rises. In both cases, unless something like government price controls prevents the market price from fully adjusting, it will keep moving until it reaches the equilibrium price. Here's a did you get it? I've decided not to have you guys respond in the discussion. This is just a good way for you to check yourself if you got the concept, and if you don't, you can ask it when we have our video chat. Why can we expect the price of a good to reach the equilibrium price? That's what you should be able to answer at this point in our lecture. So go ahead and pause and think about that. All right, so here we are back. Let's finish our lecture. We just have one last concept to go over. Scarcity and prices. Now that you understand how a market reaches equilibrium, you can see that both the supply curve and the demand curve influence the price of a good. The supply and demand curves work like two blades of a pair of scissors. Just as both blades are necessary to cut through a piece of paper, both curves work to determine the equilibrium price and quantity in a market. The interaction of supply and demand also explains why some prices are high and others are low. The relative scarcity of a good, meaning the size of demand relative to supply, is the key to price determination. When there is a lot of demand for something that is in short supply, like gold, Super Bowl tickets, Picasso paintings, the relative scarcity causes the good to be expensive, even though no one really needs it to survive. The same idea explains why many goods that are very important to us, such as food and clothing, are available at much lower prices. For these goods, prices are low because supply is high relative to demand. A final example of this idea of scarcity and prices. The diamond water paradox. Why are diamonds expensive while water is cheap? After all, water is essential for survival, whereas diamonds are a luxury good used mainly in jewelry. This presents a paradox, or seeming contradiction. How can something as important as water have a lower price than something unessential like diamonds? The question, known as the diamond water paradox, was posed by Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. Smith did not provide a satisfactory answer, but another English economist, William Stanley Jevons, seen here, did. Jevons pointed out that people are willing to pay a very high price for water when they don't have very much. But because water is not very scarce, the supply is large relative to the demand, people don't have to pay a high price. The plentiful supply moves the equilibrium point very far down along the market demand curve, driving down the equilibrium price. Any seller who asks a high price, say $20, for a bottle of water will not be able to attract a buyer, even for a fancy bottle of Evian water. Diamonds, by contrast, are found in only 3 U.S. states and a small number of countries, making the available quantity relatively small. Some buyers are willing to pay several $1,000s for a diamond. They would pay even more for the first few pints of water needed to stay alive, but they don't have to because water is plentiful. For diamonds, buyers do have to pay a high price because the limited supply leaves the equilibrium point in the demand market higher up on the demand curve. So, our last did you get it? Why are some goods that nobody needs more expensive than some goods that are essential to life? Excuse me. See if you can answer that question in a sentence or two. Again, you're not turning that in, no discussion. This is just a check for yourself. Also, if you really want to challenge yourself, draw a supply and demand curve and show why that is true. And if you want to share that with me, I will give you some comments and feedback back on what you drew. That will be a good challenge if you really want to grasp this concept. All right, that's the end of our lecture. Hope you have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.